boy. Welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and I am so ecstatic to tell you about the big Barbenheimer double feature hitting cinemas this weekend. If you weren't aware, Greta Gerwig and Christopher Nolan, two of the most exciting directors working now. Christopher Nolan, an exciting director from the past few decades. Greta Gerwig, a director that really burst onto the scene in the past few years. Both released two pretty big marquee event films this weekend, and they both happen to come out on the same day. And rather than people picking or choosing, well, am I going to see this? Am I going to see that? A lot of people have been watching them both as one big double feature, as did I. And I will get into all the double feature-ness in just a sec, which one you should see first. Should you see them as a double feature? And then I will obviously talk about both films separately. Before I get into those movies, I do want to address one thing that I haven't really addressed on the channel, which is the SAG-AFTRA strike, and of course the Writers Guild strike, which I have talked about a little bit on other videos. According to SAG guidelines, I am allowed to review films. Criticism is allowed because I think of criticism more as discussion rather than promotion, and according to SAG guidelines, SAG members are not allowed to promote films. I am not a SAG member anyway. I am non-union, but I still want to stand in solidarity with the actors and with the writers who are striking. So in order to show my support, I am going to link a bunch of resources down in the description if you want to find out more information about the SAG-AFTRA and Writers Guild strikes, and if you want to donate to the causes to help these actors and writers survive, because the Actors Guild is not just made up of big Hollywood celebrities. There are also up-and-coming actors who are members of SAG but could really use the support right now as we fight to get them equal wages, and I do stand 100% with the SAG-AFTRA strike. As I said, I am not a member of SAG, and I am not even a promoter. I don't get paid by any of the studios to talk about these films. I talk about these films because I'm excited in creating the discussions. I do see how some people perceive criticism as promotion, though. You're basically telling people what you thought about a movie, and that usually entices them to either see it or not see it. I am not paid by a studio to promote a film, but by just talking about a film, I could see how I could sway someone to go see it. So because of that, because I understand that, I'm going to kind of cut down on videos highlighting new films by struck studios. And then when I do feel so overwhelmed with thoughts that I need to talk about those films, like for example Barbenheimer, I will be putting this kind of disclaimer at the beginning because I do still want to show my support for SAG-AFTRA and Writers Guild because they are who matter most. Without them, we don't have any of these films. We don't even have any films to talk about from these studios. So I think it's important, even if I'm going to be talking about struck studios work, that I put a disclaimer. Even if I'm not talking about struck studios work, I will still put these disclaimers in because I think it's very important. So yes, check the description below. Now getting into Barbenheimer, I mean, what a fun time at the cinema, just to walk into the movie theaters and see half of people wearing pink, half people wearing these suits and fedoras like Oppenheimer, and some people kind of marrying the two. I saw some people wearing suit jackets over pink shirts. I saw some people, this big TikTok trend of people wearing the suit and tie, but then wearing like thongs underneath their pants that are visible enough to show the Barbie support.
This is my official outfit for the Barbie movie on July 21st. You probably thought it was gonna be like a pink dress or something funny for the Barbie movie. No, quit being corny, just wear normal clothes to the movie theater. Come on.
I think there are similar themes, of course, in just overall what both films have to say about America. They say both very different things, but very relevant and important things about America. But I think in terms of style, I mean, these could not be any more different. And that kind of raises the question of, should you double feature these to begin with? For the moment, to feel like you're a part of the culture, like, I totally get why you would want to double feature. That's why I did. I started with Oppenheimer because I wanted something a little heavier to then kind of enjoy Barbie as a dessert, to kind of lift me up in a more positive way. So I went home, went to bed happy. The only thing about this, though, is that if you're going right from Oppenheimer to Barbie, you don't have time to really sit with the weight of Oppenheimer. But I believe if you went from Barbie to Oppenheimer, you might go home and feel in more of a downer mood if you ended on Oppenheimer. So ultimately, I don't think you even need to double feature these, but I do get why people want to and why I wanted to. So I think if you do double feature it, just kind of think about what you want to prioritize. Do you want to prioritize going home happy and in good spirits, or do you want to go home with a lot more to chew on in terms of like these really like deep, dark thoughts? And there's really no right or wrong. And that's not to say that Barbie doesn't have deep, dark thoughts as well, but I think Barbie ultimately resolves all of it with like a nice tight little bow, whereas Oppenheimer kind of leaves you a lot more to linger with. And that doesn't mean that one film is better than the other. Again, this is totally subjective. I enjoyed both movies a lot, but just in terms of double featuring, I think there's a pro and a con to whatever order you decide to put them in. But I did enjoy going from Oppenheimer to Barbie, though I do wish I had time to sit with Oppenheimer. But then again, I can't imagine going home without ending the night on Barbie. You know, it just felt right. But either way, it's an exciting time to be a movie fan. It's exciting to see people excited about two films that, while one is IP based, they aren't part of big franchises. You know, one is completely original as a biopic about a man who did exist, but, you know, it's based on a book. It's not based on any sort of other movie or pre-existing IP. And then Barbie, while it is, like I said, an IP, you know, it's a Mattel product, it's still an original story set within those parameters. It reminds me of the Lego movie, how it was kind of its own complete unique take on a property that we all know, but telling a story that is totally new. So let's get into each one separately. I'm going to start with Oppenheimer, just because I'm going to go in the order I saw it in. I think Oppenheimer is... I don't want to jump the gun here, but I think it may just be my favorite Nolan film I've ever seen. Christopher Nolan, one of my favorite directors, directed one of my favorite superhero trilogies, if not my favorite superhero trilogy, The Dark Knight. That's really what got me into Nolan's filmography. But going back, I just really love seeing how Nolan kind of bends time, and not necessarily in the Interstellar Tenet way where time is literally bending and changing and unfolding before your eyes, but just in the way he non-linearly tells his stories. I mean, Memento is a great example of a story that's told both forwards and backwards, bouncing off of one another, color, black and white, and a similar device is used here, obviously not to necessarily show passing of time, but to show different character perspectives. We see a lot of stuff in color that is from Cillian Murphy's Dr. Oppenheimer perspective, and then you see everything from Robert Downey Jr.'s perspective in black and white, and I think that creates a really interesting device. But even taking the black and white and color cinematography out of the picture, just the way it's told non-linearly is so exciting, and I feel like this is something that Nolan's kind of been experimenting with for a lot of time, with a lot of his past few films, just kind of playing with time and how he tells a story non-linearly but still gets to the point he wants to make while also not making it too confusing. And I feel like some of his films have gotten a little confusing, and this storytelling narrative device is almost at a fault, whereas here I think he's truly mastered it. Like, this feels like a director kind of mastering a cinematic craft, but also a writer kind of figuring out his own narrative craft as well, because I think a lot of the criticisms with Nolan, at least from other people, not as much me, but the fact that he's a very visual filmmaker and he's very good at that, but his storytelling lacks a bit. His writing, the way he writes female characters, and that's all stuff I agree with to an extent, but I think Oppenheimer's where he kind of figures it out. He figures out that perfect balance to where the pacing and the actual visual mastery of it all is breathtaking, but I think the actual narrative and the way the story is told, when information is told, when things are revealed, is even more exciting than the stuff going on visually. And that is so exciting to see, because Nolan himself, I feel like, has grown so much as a storyteller, and this kind of feels like, I hate to be redundant of everyone on Twitter, but it feels like his magnum opus in that way, because it feels like everything that he's been doing in his career has been building to this one singular film. Kind of like Oppenheimer himself in the film, how everything kind of builds to this one catastrophic event.
Truman needs to know what's next.
2,
What's next?
1.
But rather than, you know, your traditional biopic where we would end the film with the bomb and then kind of give us maybe a few title cards to say, like, this is what happened after. Instead, we see the aftermath. And the film is 3 hours, but I feel like it uses every single one of its minutes entirely wisely, because that first act, that first hour, you really need to set up who Oppenheimer is, his relationships, why he himself as a person is the way he is. The second act is kind of getting into the crux of the main story, being the creation of the bomb and kind of the complications in making it and then testing it. Then the third act is when the bomb's dropped, what happens as a result? It's not the most visually spectacle-driven big moments of the film, but I think it's maybe some of the most exciting because of the way it's paced. Like I said, the scenes are kind of intercut with one another, the editing, the tension. I think in this film, we see Nolan's best sequence, his best scene, and his best shot. And without spoiling in direct detail what those are, I'm going to kind of give a broad summary. His best sequence, I mean, this building up to the bomb and the actual tension of the first test run of this bomb, the suspense is some of the best ever I've seen in film. This whole sequence, the series of events, all the scenes that lead up to it, and then the actual test of the bomb itself. And as that clock kind of ticks down from 10 to 9 to 8 to 7, kind of like the trailers did, where you're just kind of on the edge of your seat waiting to see what happens next, even though you know what's going to happen next. You know how history unfolds, but it's just the tension leading up to it so good. And then the best scene of his career, I think, is actually right after that. You see a scene where Oppenheimer's giving a speech to what looks like a bunch of students.
The world will remember this day.
And in that speech, you can kind of see the PTSD in his mind almost kind of overcome himself. And you start to see things literally through the eyes of Oppenheimer. And you see all this horror imagery that is very fascinating. I think that's the best scene of Nolan's career. And then in terms of just flat out shots, I think this has one of the best shots of his career. There's a scene where Oppenheimer's being questioned and a previous affair kind of comes into conversation, and there's this really interesting shot where you can kind of see Oppenheimer being interviewed and you see the back of a head, and then as the camera kind of pans, the head moves over and behind it you see Emily Blunt, his wife, sitting in the background, so overcome with emotion. And I love that shot. It's one singular shot, but that's what I'm saying. I think Nolan has been building to this moment in his career where I think he has the ability to convey so much with a single shot, so much with a single scene, and so much with a broader sequence, to where I can't even say this act was better than this act, it was better than this act, because I think all three acts are vital in working alongside one another to create this whole. And I think it's one of the most amazing film experiences I've ever had. Like, I cannot point out a flaw. I think some people have been saying that there's a problem with the mix of the audio. I didn't feel that. I thought the audio was amazing. The way sound is used in this thing, when it's used in a very big way, it's really impactful, but especially when there's no sound at all, when it kind of cuts out. I think the score is amazing, the way the score is kind of used in almost every second of this thing, but then there are very few moments where the score is absent, where it's supposed to be really felt. The consistent use of score of this thing makes it almost feel operatic in a sense, because it feels like there is no time to breathe, and that's kind of a device that Nolan wants to convey here. He wants you to feel like every single second matters, so he's gonna score every single moment. And I know some people might not like that. Some people might not like an overindulgence of score, but then you look at like Indiana Jones and Star Wars, like every single moment of those films is also scored. So I think it's just a matter of preference in that case. But I didn't notice any audio issues. In fact, I felt the audio was probably the most impactful element in terms of technicals, but just the idea that all these explosions and all these effects are completely non-CGI, that's also exciting. It makes me feel like cinema's back in a way that feels reminiscent of the way cinema was, not the way cinema's going, you know, especially in the midst of a writer's strike and the actor's strike with AI and technology and green screen and all that stuff. And there's a time and place for green screen, of course, and CGI, but I think it's almost more impressive to see someone do so much with no CGI, in this case, Oppenheimer, with all the explosions and everything, and just the overall visual mastery of the cinematography.
You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves. And the world is not prepared.
I could go on and on. I think this movie is fantastic. I think Cillian Murphy is terrific as the lead, as Dr. Oppenheimer. I think Robert Downey Jr. has some really key standout moments, especially in the third act. He kind of takes it over, and we see most of it from his perspective, and it's really amazing. Florence Pugh has some scene-stealing moments. Emily Blunt has some scene-stealing moments. Matt Damon, Benny Safdie. I mean, there's so many amazing actors in this thing, so much so that there were actors I didn't even remember were in this thing. And I'm not even going to rattle off names because I don't know if it's a spoiler, but there are 2 Best Actor winners from the last decade that popped up for one scene, and I was like, wow, okay, so they got him. Great. Oh, they got him? Awesome. I think it's important that it is Oppenheimer's story first and foremost, and the other kind of characters around him are supporting characters, and I think Nolan understands that, and Nolan uses these supporting actors to bring as much life to these supporting characters without overstepping the overall story he wants to tell, being this character study about this man and his love for science kind of being his downfall as well. I've seen a lot of comparisons saying that this is Nolan's Social Network, this is Nolan's Wind Rises, this is Nolan's Tree of Life, his JFK, his Saving Private Ryan, and yes, all those are true. I see all of those influences in this movie, but I also think it's important that while we can say this feels like JFK because of the way the courtroom stuff is staged and the way the conspiracy stuff kind of trickles in, or you could say this is the Tree of Life kind of thing with the way it's shot and edited, or you can say it's like the Social Network because of the way it bounces back and forth between timelines, or, you know, you could say it's an Amadeus-like thing because of the rivalry between Robert Downey Jr. and Cillian Murphy's characters. You can say all this, but I also think it's important to say that this is Oppenheimer. This is Nolan's masterwork, and I think that is why this is going to be a film that other people reference when talking about future films. They're going to say, oh, this is so-and-so director's Oppenheimer.
Chances are near zero.
Near zero.
What do you want from theory alone?
0.
would be nice.
And I get it. We always want to compare to other films we've seen, and I think that's a valuable way of recommending a film to someone, is saying, if you like this, you'll like this. But I think it's important to say that Oppenheimer is wholly and truly unique in and of itself, and it is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen on screen. So I highly recommend it. And now we're going over to Barbie Land. Barbie, directed by Greta Gerwig. Now, I am such a fan of Greta Gerwig's first three movies, Nights and Weekends, Lady Bird, Little Women, so the expectations for this were high. Like I said with Christopher Nolan, his past few films have felt almost experimental, where they almost felt like test runs for Oppenheimer. So I think Nolan was kind of coming off of a low with Oppenheimer, whereas Greta Gerwig has been riding this high. I don't think she has ever experienced a low, so there were a lot of stakes with Barbie. And I will say off the bat, I do prefer her first three films first, but that is not to take away from the fact that Barbie is an amazing motion picture. I think it's more so just a compliment to the fact that she has made three amazing films in addition to Barbie. I think she's going 4 for 4 here. I think she continues to evolve as a filmmaker in such interesting ways. You know, Nights and Weekends was a collaborative effort, really kind of stripped down indie feature. Lady Bird, you know, was her first solo directorial effort, and then Little Women was her taking a book and adapting it. And here it's kind of similar, because she's taking a property and adapting it, but she's really not telling a Barbie story we've ever heard before. The film centers around this idealistic, stereotypical Barbie. She's literally called the stereotypical Barbie, played by Margot Robbie, who is excellent here. We'll get into more of her performance later, but this Barbie experiences perfect days every day, and every day is fun and perfect.
This is the best day ever.
It is the best day ever. So is yesterday, and so is tomorrow, and every day from now until forever.
And women hold power in her world, and then one day she starts to have these existential thoughts.
Do you guys ever think about dying?
And it takes her to a journey beyond Barbie Land into the real world with Ken, played by Ryan Gosling. More on his performance later as well. But they go into the real world, and she realizes that the real world is not this perfect utopia and fantasy it once seemed to be in her world.
What's going on? Why are these men looking at me?
Yeah, they're also staring at me.
And I think that's a really interesting premise, but it's how you evolve that premise that I think is what most people were wondering when it came to Barbie, and I think she evolves it in a really interesting way. I was worried that once we left Barbie Land, we wouldn't come back, but I think that's actually the most exciting stuff in the film, is when certain characters in the real world then want to take stuff they learned in the real world and bring it back to Barbie Land, and you start to see how Barbie Land and the real world start to kind of intertwine, and I think that is kind of some of the most exciting stuff in the film, and some of the most interesting stuff, because this is, all in all, a pretty blatant feminist piece. You know, it really wants to get to the core of what feminism is, and talk about gender roles, and I think that's really valuable. And I've seen some criticisms where it's like, oh, it wasn't kid-friendly enough, the dialogue is too intelligent, you know, but it's Greta Gerwig, and I think if you've seen her other works, you kind of know what you're going to get into when it comes to the language. I mean, Little Women is a children's novel as well. I mean, young girls read Little Women, but that language was still heightened because I think Greta Gerwig just has a really interesting voice and an interesting way of speaking and writing dialogue that I don't think that's necessarily a criticism of the film, more so criticism of expectations. If you expected a movie for the littlest ones to enjoy, there's going to be some language and some jokes that go over their head, but I think there's still enough color, enough dazzling stuff from the production design, the set design, the costumes are fantastic and colorful. I think that's going to really still appeal to younger audiences, but I feel like being a kids movie wasn't really promised with this one. From the marketing, from the very first joke in the trailer where they're talking about beaching one another off, I think it was made very clear that this is not a movie for kids, or at least not a movie solely for kids. It's a movie kids could enjoy, but it's more so for the adults and for the women who are of this age where they want to start making a difference, but they feel like they are kind of held back by the way society is and the way society views women and views gender roles in general. And I think that is very valuable.
Ideas live forever.
There's a lot in here about the way beauty is perceived and the way young girls as well as older women kind of have to try to fit within a certain beauty standard and what Barbie actually represents as a brand. Now, I did say as a brand because it is pretty blatant here, and we've seen it just from the marketing that while it is a very powerful and amazing feminist piece, this is still a movie that is co-produced by Mattel, and it still has to represent the brand in a successful way. And I think that if I had any criticism to give the film, it's that if this movie was entirely produced and there was no Mattel attached to it, I think they could have gotten even more critical of the overall Mattel brand and the way Mattel is run. You know, there are jokes about how Mattel is entirely run by men, and at first it's like a funny laughing point, but then the more you think about it, you're like, wow, yeah, that's kind of effed up, you know, especially the fact that, like, Barbie was supposed to be that toy that could show women that they could be anything and that they should strive to be the best they could be. And while it does engage with some of the criticisms of Mattel, I think it could have gone even further to where the end of the film, it almost feels like the Mattel villains of the film, played by Will Ferrell, who's like the CEO of Mattel in this film, they kind of get off a little easy. Mattel wants people to see this movie and learn a lot from it, and they're still letting Gerwig kind of speak her truth and get through these amazing, powerful themes of feminism, but at the end of the day, they still want to sell Barbie toys and Barbie clothes. You know, they still want people to be interested in their product. And I just think that when you think about that aspect, it's you know, a little unfortunate.
Catastrophic!
But I do still think, despite the fact that this is essentially a giant toy commercial, I still think Greta Gerwig finds enough of her ethos and her voice in this film. And I think without Gerwig's voice, if this was just kind of a direct for hire type of deal, I think you would have seen something a lot more irresponsible, fitting between the lines rather than coloring outside of them. And I think Greta Gerwig, because of who she is as a writer and a director, you know, she's co-writing this with Noah Baumbach, her husband, but I think it's important that her voice is there to show that it is not just a toy commercial, but there's actual substance to the style and to the brand of it all. And I think what she has to say about the Barbie brand is interesting. The fact that Barbie, which was originally standing for something, ended up standing for something else that is a lot more negative than what it originally stood for when it was invented. And I think there's a lot of interesting conversation there. I just wish it had gone a little bit further in criticizing Mattel. And this is a criticism I've had with other films this year, like Air. The fact that, you know, there's a one line by Jason Bateman where he talks about sweatshops and then he kind of just brushes it under the rug because, you know, they still want to sell Air Jordans. You know, they're not going to be too critical of their own brand. And I feel like that's the thing here, is they try to make some jokes at Mattel's expense, but I still feel like Mattel is still kind of like getting off with as little blood on their hands as they can. And I just wish they dug a little bit deeper into that aspect. But again, this film is so funny. The jokes land. I think some of the best jokes were put in the trailer, and I wish that weren't the case because I saw some of them coming, but there are jokes that aren't in the trailer that are really amazing. Like I said, the feminist messaging is so important because it's not just women rule, men suck either. And I think a lot of people have been going on Twitter and being like, it's anti-man, you know, it's setting a bad message, and I don't know what movie they watched. It almost seems like they watched half the movie, or maybe they just didn't watch the movie, because I think at the end, especially with Ken's journey, I think they have a lot to say about men and women in this film, which I think is honestly something that surprised me, because I think the way you think the film is going, it's going to totally villainize all the men in the film, but I think they do a good job kind of giving Ken this kind of well-rounded arc, and I think Ryan Gosling plays the role really well.
I talked to a doctor.
You are talking to a doctor.
And I need a clicky pen?
No.
A sharp thing?
No.
There he is. Doctor!
Somebody get security.
He's such an underrated comedian. If you watch The Nice Guys, if you watch certain parts of La La Land, you really get that comedic timing. He's really, really good at comedy, and I wish he did more comedy, and I think this is one of the best comedic performances he's ever given, but he does have some real heart, especially at the end of the film, while never losing that goofy comedic charm.
I'm just kidding. Where I see love, she sees a friend.
And then Margot Robbie, she's amazing as well. I think with the abundance of characters, there are some characters that feel a little underdeveloped. There's this really amazing plotline of America Ferrera's character and her daughter that I wish had been resolved with a little bit more, you know, just a little more. I almost feel like this film could have been a little longer to kind of just flesh out a few more things. There's a character named Alan, played by Michael Cera, who's just kind of this doll that's not a Ken or a Barbie, he just exists in this world. I feel like they could have given him maybe something else at the end.
There are no multiples of Alan. He's just Alan.
Yeah, I'm confused about that.
And that kind of brings me back to my main point about Margot Robbie, where Margot Robbie is amazing in this film, but I feel like because it has so many characters to talk about and so many characters to juggle, Margot Robbie almost feels forgotten in some aspects because there's just so many other things to deal with in this film. But I think Margot Robbie, especially in the quiet moments, is really exceptional. I mean, there are moments where she's just sitting and thinking, or she has her eyes closed and she's like kind of envisioning these things in her head, and you can just see with a single teardrop how much she's able to convey beyond words. And I think that's a really powerful thing for any actor. And she nails the comedy, but I think the drama here is really what's most impressive for her. I think there's an amazing moment where she sees this old woman on the bench, and it's the first old lady she's ever seen in the real world, because no Barbies look like these older women. And she just turns to her and she says, just impulsively, "You're beautiful." And the old woman says, "I know." And it's one of these really emotional moments. I'm getting choked up talking about it. Greta Gerwig, you rock. You're amazing. I'm getting choked up thinking about it, because it's like one of those really subtle moments that doesn't feel like it's, made to be this big emotional punch in the gut, but it's really kind of encompassing of this whole idea, this idea of beauty standards, and the idea that beauty doesn't age and beauty is found in all shapes and forms. And I think it's Barbie in that moment also realizing her own beauty standards and what beauty means to her, and seeing something that she finds so beautiful in the real world. And it's just so good. Like, I just think it's such a good movie. And I think it's just really awesome that you're seeing two films that could not be any more different coming out on the same day, because I think there's something for everyone in all these films. If you want something a little darker, a little sadder, I mean, Oppenheimer has that, but I think Barbie also has stuff to chew on. There's a lot of thematic stuff going on here that I think is really valuable, really important. Sure, some of the dialogue is a little heightened for younger audiences, like I said, but I still think the overall messaging comes through. And even if a kid doesn't necessarily understand all that's going on, I think having a parent sit with that kid afterwards and kind of explain it, I think that could be a really valuable conversation to have as well, to where I think mothers should bring their daughters to this movie. I think mothers should bring their sons. I think fathers should go with them, because I think this is something that the whole family can learn from and enjoy as well. I really think Greta Gerwig is one of the most impressive and important voices we have in cinema today. Just seeing her on her Letterboxd video kind of go through all the inspirations, you can see all those inspirations in this film. The Demi inspirations with all the color, the umbrellas of Cherbourg, and the Donen inspirations with Singing in the Rain, especially in these big musical numbers, is really evident. These kind of dream ballet type sequences, but also there are inspirations from stuff like The Truman Show. I mean, there's a reference to The Godfather. This is clearly someone who has a love for film, pour as much of this kind of nostalgic love for film into a single vision while never losing sight of her overall message. And I think her message is something that is going to be timeless for anyone who watches it, and it really struck a chord with me. And I hate to even say I prefer one film over the other. I just really recommend them both, and I do think there's something of value to be taken from each of these films. So that is my review on Barbie and Oppenheimer. I know I left stuff out, because when you have two films and you see two films back to back, there's so much to kind of sort through in your brain. So further down the line on top 10 videos, because these movies will probably end up on some top 10 videos when we talk about Oscars next year, because these movies will probably be nominated for some Oscars. I can already see Gosling versus Downey Jr. being your best supporting actor race right there. But I really think we're going to hear a lot more about these movies as the year progresses, and I can't wait to continue talking about them and having that conversation. So please let me know down in the comments what you thought of Barbie and Oppenheimer. If you saw both, if you saw neither, which one did you see first? And did you like seeing that one first, or do you wish you had reversed it? Like I said, I really don't have an opinion. I think it would have worked either way. I would think it would have worked separately and together. This is an exciting time to be a movie fan. But remember, there is still a SAG-AFTRA strike and a Writers Guild strike going on. So please check out those links down below also to get more information on that. And if you have any questions, ask below, because I'd be happy to answer them as well. Thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend. Come on, Oppie. Let's go party. Let's go.